Right, you're live.
Good evening, all. My name is John McGeady, and I am the Justice Officer with the Sisters of Our Lady of Apostles. You're welcome to this evening's conversation on human trafficking. This event has been organised by the Joint Justice Committee of the OLA Sisters and the SMA Fathers. Today is the International Day of Prayer and Awareness Against Human Trafficking, held on the feast day of St Josephine Bakhita, who was the survivor of slavery and human trafficking. The OLA Sisters, the Sisters of Our Lady of Apostles, are a missionary congregation with a particular focus on Africa and a commitment to women and girls. Arising from this commitment, the OLA Sisters have become increasingly interested in the issue of human trafficking, which, while not limited to women and girls, certainly has a strongly gendered dimension to it. A key area of concern for both the OLA Justice Desk and the Justice Office of the Society of African Missions has been to raise awareness about the issue of human trafficking and to advocate for more robust public policy and greater investment in trafficking efforts. To mark the International Day of Prayer and Awareness Against Human Trafficking, I'm pleased to have David Lohan with us this evening to explore the problem of trafficking and to discuss his new book, At Freedom's Crossroads, Making Sense of Modern Slavery, which is available for anybody to pick up. David, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you, John, and just thank you as well just to all at the OLA, and just I send greetings on this feast of St Josephine Bakhita.
Thanks very much, David. So for the audience tuning in on Facebook Live, for those following those of you following our conversation this evening, just please, any questions that you have, we'd love to have them. So, David and I will have a conversation now this evening for 20, 30, at the most, I would say 40 minutes. And, we'd welcome comments from you, any questions from you, and you can simply submit those questions in the comment section directly under this video on your Facebook page. And your contribution to this conversation are most welcome. So please, if you do have any questions for David, just post them and I'll bring them to his attention, and it can contribute to our conversation this evening. So David, maybe before we begin properly, perhaps you could explain what is meant by the term human trafficking and modern day slavery for our viewers and listeners this evening.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, they're great questions, and an awful lot of the issue itself is actually very much wrapped up in that question. Essentially, is what is human trafficking and what is modern day slavery? I suppose if you were to look back at the old form of slavery, probably the kind of thing that we would all be familiar with. When someone talks about slavery, we have a good idea of what that entails, although we probably consign slavery wrongly to the past. So certainly slavery in certain forms used to be legal. Certainly in the United States, chattel slavery was legal, and that was that legal form whereby one person could own another. And there was a famous case, the Dred Scott case in the United States. And Dred Scott was a slave who took his situation to court. And what the court ruled was that he was just an item of trade, something to be trafficked, essentially at the discretion of his owner. So the word traffic itself means trade, although it's often wrongly interpreted to mean movement. It doesn't mean movement at all. It's the whole essence of trade. And that notion of trade is really important because, it can be trade for money. Sometimes it's not for money, but it's nonetheless a trade, a market. So when we talk about human trafficking, what we're actually talking about is a trade in human beings. And of course, because of this idea maybe that slavery is something that doesn't belong in the modern world, that needs to be challenged, we talk about modern day slavery. And some would say that human trafficking is part of a series of slave practices that could be encapsulated by modern day slavery. And I think for myself, though, having done all the research that I have over the last number of years, I think one of the difficulties is that, so much explanation needs to be given to those terms. And for my own part, I think it would actually be better understood just simply as slavery, because people instinctively know slavery. They know what, when we talk about slavery, they know what we mean. And I think often we have to explain these terms too much. And the real message, I suppose, from tonight is that slavery is still very much with us in the world. And I know those who work in missionary work will often experience this as a reality through their work, something maybe unexpected, but something certainly they encounter, and hence the weight given to the issue by the OLA sisters.
And absolutely, it unfortunately increasingly is an issue that is coming up, and there are many religious congregations around the world, particularly women religious, but not exclusively women religious, who are tackling, who are finding themselves coming into contact with victims of slavery, of human trafficking, trying to provide them with supports, and trying to tackle this crime. And at the European level, for example, there's the group Renate, which is the Religious of Europe network against trafficking and exploitation. So as you said, that's one example of religious congregations coming together to work to combat this crime. You've mentioned, David, yourself that that you've done a lot of research on this topic now. But perhaps you could tell us a little bit about yourself, David. It's good to sometimes know a little bit of the author. Your professional background is actually in IT. So tell me, how does it come that a software engineer ends up writing not one but actually two books on human trafficking? How did you become engaged in this issue?
Okay, so my base degree is in the field of engineering, but like many engineers, I found myself as the years went by in the field of information technology, and I do various things on that over the years. And I suppose as we get older, sometimes we like to move from, maybe we pay a lot of attention to what we call the hard skills, and certainly engineering and information technology very much in the field of the hard skills. And I suppose as one matures, you realize that there's a lot to learn too in other areas, in the areas of soft skills, and also I suppose maybe there's a mission in all of us, and that maybe it isn't fulfilled necessarily through what we do day to day. And certainly, it was always something I wanted to do for a long time, was to do some work in a voluntary capacity. So some years ago, when I arrived in Cork first, I decided that was an opportunity to do that. And I came across an advert for the Cush China, which was run by the Society of African Missions in Cork. And at that time, the charity was looking for someone who would undertake research. And well, I'm always good at, poking around and finding bits of information, so I could make myself useful in there. So what I was asked to do was kind of a little bit unexpected from my point of view. It was to research the issue of African witchcraft in human trafficking. And I suppose I found that to be a fascinating area, a very sad area, just the humanity of what was done to people, how very callous people were treated, really as if they were just something that was disposable to be used and abused. And of all the areas, really, that particular area has always remained very close to my heart, because that was my first engagement. And that engagement was with the SMAs and with the OLAs. So we did a body of research, and a book was produced. With Jerry Ford, Father Angelo Lafferty, Dr. Jennifer Dewan, myself, we put together a book on the issue. So we addressed African witchcraft, and as it applied also to Ireland, and the reality of it. One very important contribution was made by Sister Monica Onwale of OLA, who had first-hand experience of seeing these issues, and through her missionary work of encountering victims of human trafficking in Europe, people who had gone through these kind of African rites and how they were exploited and the plight that they endured. So that was how I got in, really involved with the issue, and I've always stayed very close to it one thing I just say about, I suppose, one thing that I bring with me is because of my engineering background, because of my business background, I'm very interested in the why aspect. So rather than maybe looking at necessarily discrete places and instances and types, I'm very interested in asking the question, why does this happen? And what does it mean to be a slave? What's the real condition of a person who's held in slavery? And the other question, I suppose, is what can we all do about it to tackle slavery in the modern world?
And just on that whole issue of witchcraft and it, you know, and its relation with human trafficking, it was really a form of control, a kind of a sort of a psychological control over people. Would that be right? Would that be fair to say?
That's right. Yeah, it's just so in West Africa, in some parts of West Africa, and some would say farther beyond, but what's generally acknowledged in particular parts of West Africa, there are cultural beliefs, and the anthropologists would say these are cultural beliefs in juju. And juju is such an important part of life that one might say that juju is life itself. It's inextricably linked. Now, that might seem odd to us in the West, but we can probably find parallels in Irish life here as well, where, for example, you could think of things like the belief in the fairies. And this is taken very seriously. And I mean, you see things like in farming situations where, around there was all the whole thing about ring forts and about not cutting certain bushes. You'd leave them in place because of. So the same happens in West Africa and other places too. But particularly in West Africa, there's this belief in juju, which people themselves would describe as voodoo. So they'd expect that that's something that we would know about, juju and voodoo. And they're a subset, they're part of this African witchcraft.
Okay.
And what happens is that human traffickers have learned that they can manipulate individuals, usually women and girls, into situations of human trafficking using these beliefs. And what they do is they offer a wonderful opportunity to come to a place called Ireland, and they'll pay all the expenses. But the person is put in a situation of debt. They're going to have to pay back the debt. And in order to guarantee that they will pay back the debt, they have to swear this terrible oath. Now, there's a whole ritual behind that I won't go into the details of.
Sure.
And it's quite horrific. And people come out the other side quite traumatized.
Okay.
And this is taken extremely seriously. You do not break juju oaths. This is seen as the most powerful of all oaths. And of course, then the individual may come to Ireland or other parts of Europe, and they find out this wonderful opportunity didn't exist. It never existed. Nonetheless, they're in a situation of debt bondage, which itself is a form of slavery. They have to pay back this debt. They're compelled to do so by their juju oath, which they're absolutely terrified of. And that is, they're reminded of that persistently. So it becomes a form of leverage over them. And most often what they find themselves in is in the sex trade, in prostitution. And literally thousands upon thousands of women and girls have been taken out of parts of West Africa, just using this particular method to control them. And manipulated by essentially what are criminal syndicates, numbers of people, groups of people who are working together in tandem to deliver these girls and women into Europe and beyond, and to exploit them for money.
So, I mean, what you described there really is, is a kind of somebody who is going to be experiencing being sort of completely under somebody's control. And even if, I suppose, if somebody may not necessarily have to be handcuffed, they're still under somebody else's control. They're still going to be subject to the will and the whim of another person. So, I mean, that's one element. That's and that's one form of control. And obviously, there are many other forms of control being used by traffickers, to intimidate and exploit victims of trafficking. But you also, in your new book, At Freedom's Crossroads: Making Sense of Modern Slavery, you actually turn to the history of slavery in the United States, on the other side of the Atlantic. And you kind of you place slavery in that context. Now, I suppose one important thing to point out, I guess, and I'm sure people listening and viewing will be aware, obviously, slavery was legal in the United States before they had their Civil War, before Abraham Lincoln abolished it. Whereas obviously modern day human trafficking is illegal. So I suppose, David, why did you feel it was important to draw attention to that historical context in your new book in order to explain the, as you said, the making sense of modern slavery?
Yeah, I suppose it's sometimes, I suppose, we always find out from research that we can look a lot wiser after the fact than we were before it. And I think in ways there was a degree of that about the research as well. I originally went off to see what I could find about slavery from the historical context. And what ended up happening was that I found it was such a rich source of information, and it so aptly described slavery that I realized this was something I really need to investigate in depth and research at length. And particularly in the United States, what happened was that you had contributions made by three parties. So slaves, people who had been slaves themselves, you think of Frederick Douglass, for example, who had been slaves, they wrote about slavery. You know, some escaped from slavery and they wrote about it and spent the rest of their days campaigning relentlessly against slavery. Then you had people like Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote famously Uncle Tom's Cabin. And these were advocates for people who were living through the awful reality of slavery. And again, you know, they spent their days trying to help with the situation, trying to get change. But the third party, probably uniquely, that wrote about slavery as well, were actually the slaveholders. And for me, that was fascinating because you're never in a modern context going to get someone really right about what they have done. And there were quite a lot of people wrote about slavery. And these were people who used slavery day in, day out themselves. There were some who were political advocates for slavery. One in particular, Edmund Ruffin, was an intellect, and he wrote it like he was well known. He was seen as someone who was central even to the start of the Civil War. He was a fervent campaigner essentially for slavery and other things besides. So when you brought these three things together, these three different perspectives, it really gave a very rich and valuable piece of research. And it also, what it allowed me to do was step away from kind of contentious political debates, because those debates simply didn't exist 170 years ago. So I could move away from those debates and look at what people actually were saying at that time, free of those biases, and build a picture. And that's what the first third of the book looks at the history of slavery in the United States and builds this picture and says, what is slavery? What truly does it mean to be a slave? Why does slavery exist? And what can we do to end it? And for me, I suppose one of the big things that I took away from it was that really, surprisingly maybe, was there really wasn't all that much of a difference between the slavery of today and the slavery of yesteryear. And the only difference was the one that you highlighted, of course, just a moment ago, was that years ago in many states, slavery was legal. It could never be legal today. But for the most part, that was the only difference. One thing I will say as well is that in some ways, the citizens of the world were more aware of the realities of slavery in terms of they understood how they themselves contributed to it. So they were quite happy to use slavery because it delivered all these things to their homes, to their businesses. They benefited enormously from slavery. I mean, the mills of England, for example, the cotton that was brought in, the jobs, the wealth, the sheer wealth, absolutely staggering. And people understood all these benefits came directly from America's slavery.
Yeah. And I suppose, you know, you're really touching on it there, you know, but I mean, in your book, you ultimately you describe human trafficking, whether historical or contemporary, as fundamentally an economic enterprise, you know, one that's linked to supply and demand. And maybe you could unpack that a little bit more for us now, maybe in the modern context.
Yeah, I think that is important because it's the research isn't purely about obviously the past. It is about the current. So even if I spend the first section of the book looking at the past, it only truly is in service to the present. And I guess a lot of our expectations fall on government and policy to kind of address the issue of modern day slavery and human trafficking. But the reality is we all have a role to play. So the everyday items that we purchase, the decisions that we make, the services that we avail of, they all have consequences for other human beings in parts of the world. Now, often those decisions are mediated on by the market. So the market stands between us and the person who might be supplying on the other side. But we are nonetheless connected. And when we make certain decisions, we do fuel slavery. And in fact, there are surveys online where one can take a look and see, well, how many slaves do I employ through my everyday consumption? The things I buy for my household, the things I buy for my work. How many slaves am I actually? Whose reality am I perpetuating essentially through my decisions as mediated by the market? So that's why it is important to realize that this isn't purely an issue of government policy. It's not an abstract thing. This is a reality that touches on all of us, and that reality comes from the decisions that we make through the market.
And that's a difficult reality to face up to a lot of the time, to know that maybe some of my actions as a consumer are having an impact in terms of human trafficking for labor exploitation. Obviously, we hear an awful lot about human trafficking for sexual exploitation, and we know about the relationship between that and the sex industry and everything related to that, but also trafficking for labor exploitation and how that ends up in our supply chains is something that maybe we're not always as conscious of. And you've mentioned before as well, David, you've talked about the notion of going back to the antebellum American South, to slavery being associated with a crop. And obviously at that time in the American South, it was associated with the crop of cotton, and as you said, feeding the mills, the cotton mills of England and so forth. But so moving into the present day, could you describe the current global picture of human trafficking and modern slavery? I suppose you've already touched on this as well, but I mean, what is the modern crop, if we can put it that way? What is today's picture? What's going on in the world today?
Let me start with, I suppose, a number, so to give people a perspective, essentially, which is that, and the numbers escalate over the years. So when I started first over a decade ago, the estimates were there were about over 20 million people worldwide who are living as slaves. Now, the latest estimates put it at about 50 million, and I've no doubt those figures again will increase. A lot of those figures probably reside in a few places. Certainly parts of India, Pakistan, for example. But you're really accurate to say it's a crop, and that's a really important notion, because slavery is inextricably linked to certain activities. Slavery does not take hold in most activities. No. And probably in most of our lives, we're unlikely to encounter slavery. And one of the insights that comes from the past, essentially, is that where you find slavery in the past, those activities, you're likely to find it again, because it's a place where it works. And we alluded to this in the sex trade. You mentioned the sex trade and prostitution. And, I suppose what's kind of given as a sort of fatalistic view of the sex trade, its inevitability, that, it's the world's oldest profession. Well, what I've learned from my research is that if you can show me something that's old and unchanged, I can show you a place that's ideally suited to slavery. So what people don't realize when they say, well, prostitution is the world's oldest profession, what they're actually hinting at, unknowing to themselves, is that prostitution is an activity ideally suited to slavery. And that's why we say that, that human trafficking is inextricably linked to prostitution, because it's the nature of the labor, it's the nature of the crop. Some of the crops that we have nowadays would be in parts of the world, the manufacture of bricks, in parts of the world where often children work in awful conditions, with awful pollution, making bricks. And again, it's a volume type business, huge in certain parts of the world. That's a crop of sorts that's linked to slavery. unbelievably in ways, you still find places where cotton is still, and again, it just brings home again how you can't move on from the past. Cotton is again linked to slavery in parts of the world. Mechanization has probably done away with the need for it in a lot of parts of the world, but in places where mechanization hasn't touched that crop, then you still find slavery being used. There is one that I suppose I highlighted in the book as well, which was this mining. In particular, but one particular ingredient of mining was a mineral called mica, and it goes into makeup, and to give makeup its sheen. And one of the points I made was that really that it was a kind of an example of just how slavery can exist right in front of one's face. So again, this simple putting on makeup. And literally, it's something that's derived from slavery, and slavery of an especially sad kind, because it comes from often the labor of children, thousands of children who are working away relentlessly to extract this mineral from the earth.
I suppose having looked at this problem in such depth, and you've talked about some of the current examples. What do you feel is perhaps most worrying, David, in the current context?
I think for me, it's probably a reality that's always long existed, and one I pointed to earlier as well, that that sometimes it's seen as, well, slavery is an irrational thing, and if we entrust ourselves to the market, that, well, the market will sort it out as a rational actor. I don't see that for one moment. It's you really you cannot apply market rationale across the board. It doesn't work in an homogenous way, not in a uniform way. You need to say, well, what labor am I unpacking here by delivering work essentially into the sphere? Because depending on the labor, you will actually motivate people to engage in slavery essentially, or you perpetuate victimhood of people through slavery. So that for me is a concern about this kind of mindset that somehow, well, slavery is something that belonged to the past, market rationale will eliminate it. Far from the truth. It's simply not true. It's inextricably linked to the market and the type of crop being used.
So I mean, that idea that the free market will resolve it, that people are rational or that people are more enlightened than the past, is just, I mean, it's just not true.
No, absolutely not. No, and the irony, again, going back to the historical thing, was that this was understood long ago, and in fact, the reason that I suppose the slaveholders of the South fought for the Civil War, part of it was that they realized their crops would linger after slavery had been abolished, and there would be no one except themselves to work in it. So by their own definition, they would have become slaves. They understood the nature of the crop and what it required. And they didn't want to subject themselves to that. So they understood this notion of free market will absolve all issues. Just didn't work. It needed legislation, it needed enforcement, it needed legal protections, and the resources of the state to go in there and stop it, and it still needs that, I guess. Yeah, it does. Yeah, and awareness by individuals as citizens. And us as Christians as well, to realize that we all have a role to play. We might not feel that, we have an impact, but we certainly do. One of the things about this business, and it is a business, is that it's very much affected by volume. People focus often on profitability, but profit is driven by volume, not by margin. So we think about, selling price over a cost price and the margin. Actually, a lot of this work, when you see it, it seems scarcely worth doing. It's very much a volume business, but that's actually empowering from our point of view as individual consumers, because it's disproportionately affected when we decide not to support it. So every small contribution we make has an impact, and we can be assured of that. And again, just that cautionary note that I would say is for us not to, to kind of fall into the thinking that necessarily this is an issue purely for government, an issue for policy, and that we have no role to play except in that. That is simply is not the case. We all have a role to play.
Okay. Just There are a couple of questions coming in the comments, and can I encourage anybody viewing, anybody listening to this evening, or whatever time of day it is, wherever you are in the world, if you have any questions for David about this topic, please just pop them in the comments section under the video on your Facebook, and we're monitoring them and we'll bring them. There's one question here for you, David, sort of bringing us back a little bit to the beginning of our conversation, is around that issue of human trafficking, around that issue of witchcraft again. And it's somebody asks, is there a difficulty here in Europe or in Ireland in accepting witchcraft as a reality? Not that witchcraft itself necessarily is a reality, but accepting the reality that witchcraft is being used as a control mechanism in human trafficking.
I believe there is. I think it's a great question. And sadly, I think this is one of the difficulties that victims face, is that sometimes if their case had been more straightforward in some ways, you know, that if they didn't have this element, it might be more credible. But this is always the difficulty faced by slaves. It's always an uphill struggle. So yes, I think that, you know, someone who said, well, okay, I'm a victim of human trafficking, and incidentally, I have this whole element of African witchcraft, I think that's a real challenge for people to get credibility.
Okay.
I would point, however, to the fact that it's not an obscurity. So you in reports by, say, for example, the US State Department, their Trafficking in Persons report,
yeah,
and other reports by charitable organizations, and I'm thinking specifically of ECPAT, which is a big organization, works internationally against prevent the trafficking of children. This issue is highlighted, so this is understood. And police in Nigeria itself, for example, or other part in Nigeria specifically, one of the things that they have done there is that they have stopped people from swearing these oaths. They've tried to counteract, because they realized this is what part of what's going on. The people are being exploited. So I suppose it seems like an obscurity for anyone who may be facing in, but certainly for anyone who's engaged with the issue and knows about what happens in the Western African context, it's a reality. It's a well-established one. There's a lot of police involvement in it, in terms of an understanding of this is the reality of it. And there have been convictions for these kind of practices. So, you know, I would hope over time there would be more of a realization that, well, this is one of the things that human traffickers do, and it's just a characteristic of human trafficking when it comes to a particular place.
On that issue of particular crops, not a question but a comment, maybe you would like to address it, coming in from Father Anthony in Cork. I would imagine that tea pickers are likely to be very close to slavery, in that they are all day in the sun, you know, out labouring, doing hard labour all day long. That's not so much a question but a comment. And I suppose there is that question maybe arising, that is sometimes the question of where does human trafficking begin and end? Where does forced labour begin and end? Where does exploitative labour practices, which maybe aren't forced labour, but, you know, employers requiring people to work, you know, unreasonably long hours, where are the distinctions here, David, if you want to maybe comment on that?
I think it's a huge question. I think it's one that probably PhDs have been dedicated to. I think in terms of, and there are debates literally about that, the whole definitional area. You know, what are the expectations? You know, is human trafficking just equal to modern day slavery? Is there a one-to-one relationship? Is human trafficking a subset? And then when people look at other elements in terms of, like, you know, say forced marriage, again, is that a form of slavery? And I suppose this is the difficulty with the issue of slavery, and probably many other things, that, you know, when you go to look at these things, definitional elements become really problematic. And going back to that Edmund Ruffin, who wrote, I think nearly, well, probably about 170 years ago, I think, when he wrote, he said that he couldn't hope to define slavery where so many other more qualified people had tried. Now, this was a man who had used slavery himself, was an advocate for it, but even he struggled. So the whole issue of debate, or of definition rather, the whole debate on definition is enormous. And I suppose maybe we'll never get to the bottom of that one, in terms of, you know, where are the boundaries essentially.
And I suppose
that's academia in general too.
Yeah, I suppose there is, to a certain extent, you know, without wanting to lessen, I suppose maybe it might be worth saying that, or it could be one way of looking at it, rather, that there is maybe a spectrum of control and exploitation, and of different levels and intensity of control and exploitation of people. You know, that might be one way of thinking about it as well.
One of the people I interviewed for the book as well, it was in Washington DC, and he was the US ambassador at large at the time on the issue. So the US has their own ambassador on this issue. That's how important they see that this is. But he was, as far as I recall, he was a former prosecutor, I think a federal prosecutor, if memory serves, or civil rights prosecutor. And, you know, again, he had to step back, and he talked about slavery. He said, look, if I talk about slavery, people know what I'm talking about. But you know, it was that whole element of, you know, if you're a judge and you're trying to adjudicate on a situation there before you, how do you get to the point where you decide something is what you think it is? Okay. And, you know, it's that whole question again, forced labor, how much exploitation is too much. And I suppose in a general sense, I think it's more helpful to kind of step back a little bit and look at it and say, and ask myself, well, is this truly slavery? And there are always things on the periphery, I guess, you know, probably very difficult situations that we might say, well, some might say, yes, it is slavery. Others might say, no, it's not slavery, but certainly exploitative.
Yeah.
It's a tough issue. It is a tough issue.
Absolutely, absolutely. Ger from Cork has a question, a two-part question. What can we as individuals do, and how, same kind of question really, and how can we make a contribution to reducing modern slavery? Okay,
well, I think what we as individuals do, it goes back again to this thing of, we have to move beyond awareness. Awareness is certainly important. I think that's part of it, but we do have to move beyond awareness too. And look at being more active in some ways, identifying particular products and services that are derived from slavery. And we can do that. And we can, I mean, because these things are known. And for example, if you look at the Trafficking in Persons report, and if you're a company and you buy certain products from certain countries, and those products are linked to slavery, in the Trafficking in Persons report published by the US State Department, well, then that's something you should really be thinking about and saying, well, okay, where's my position on human rights and on human dignity? I mean, we're buying something here that must inextricably be linked to slavery. And we know that because it's coming out of this country, and that's, you know, slavery is used for the production of this. And I think it's exactly that. It's knowing what we're consuming and looking at ourselves as consumers, and knowing that, you know, as we consume that we're impacting on the environment, which is again an issue for slavery as well. You often find this environmental degradation and slavery go hand in hand because of the nature of slavery, and we're impacting too on our fellow human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll just double check in case there are any further questions coming in. I think that's it from the. Another question here actually. Maybe we'll take this as the last one. This is from John Healy Duffy. Something not taken seriously, especially here in Latin America. Okay, so John must be in Latin America. Is the use of very young children for begging in public areas by their parents, who are often out of sight.
Yeah. Now that's a wonderful example, because I mean, even in this country a few years ago, you would see, you know, maybe a lot more begging. You'll see it in certain contexts now still, but one thing you won't see in Ireland anymore is children begging, which is something that I would have seen in my own life here. Okay. And it's something we wouldn't have passed much notice of, really. But begging, because again, people have looked at this again with new eyes and realized that the use of children in begging is actually suited to situations of slavery. Begging is used as a form of human trafficking. And you know, in a lot of parts of the world, I mean, the more desperate a person looks, the more in keeping it is with the interests of the person who has put them there to beg. So I'm glad that issue has been brought up, especially because begging is certainly a recognized form, and particularly when it comes to children, that's something that should be taken extremely seriously.
Okay. And again, that's these definitional questions. Then, I mean, the Palermo Protocol talks about trafficking for sexual exploitation, trafficking for labor exploitation. Then the whole question of, is begging labor exploitation? It's not labor in the traditional sense of the word, but obviously it's somebody out spending all their time, the whole day, engaged in a task. Whether that's begging, or I guess also just forced criminality, maybe the whole question of pickpocketing or being forced to work as a mule for drugs or whatever it might be.
Exactly, all these forms. And I suppose that's one of the things too that I kind of painted a picture essentially of slavery in the book. And it is that you realize, okay, you look at one aspect of it and you think, well, okay, I'm describing one aspect, but then what we can't say is that all of it is wrapped up in this. And one of the things that I found in the book from slavery was that, you have one situation where a person is working extremely hard, long hours. That's one context. But the other context is where the hours are just long, the rewards come really, really slowly. So what you're describing there, John, in terms of begging is an ideal example of that, where you put someone at the side of the road, they sit for a long period of time, and occasionally they get a little bit of money. And again, that ties into the whole thing of slavery, that often the work doesn't seem worth doing. No. The rewards, it's just something that comes really, really slowly at times. And it's a very complicated picture, whether it's definitional or, the situational even as well. I mean, we have, one of the things that the slavery in the United States did was it kind of allowed us to draw kind of a box around certain things. You could think of,
this is what slavery is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you had a few things, and it kind of gave that sort of box essentially of activities. When you looked at it a bit more, you probably realized, well, maybe the box wasn't quite as tidy. And then, of course, as you look a lot more, you realize, well, actually, it's quite difficult to define the situations where slavery will arise and what it will look like when it does.
Another message here. Not a question, just a message, but a very nice message to have. Sister Anne joining from Rome, standing and marching in solidarity with us.
Okay. Well, congratulations. Best regards to Sister Anne, and thank you.
So maybe I think we've been on the call for quite a while now, David, and thanks so much for the conversation and for informing us. I suppose maybe just a final question. What do you hope to achieve with this book? Or rather, maybe that's too strong of a question, but maybe rather, what impact do you hope it might have, David?
Okay, I think a number of places, obviously among people who have an interest in the issue, I want to paint that picture of what slavery is about. And again, to draw attention to the fact that we all do have a role to play as individuals. That's not necessarily, as I say, at this kind of higher, more abstract level. I did too want to get the book into various academic areas as well, where people would inform thinking essentially, and there's been a lot of success on that. I mean, it's gone into quite a few academic university libraries, and I think over time that will become increasingly the case. But again, and people who are interested in the issue, I wanted to challenge some of the notions as well. I wanted to challenge that whole idea that the market will sort this out. It won't. And I think that's one of the conundrums for maybe globalization, is that we have this much more enthusiastic, energetic market that encapsulates much more. And one of the realities of that is that maybe it'll see a revival of slavery in the world, albeit not albeit in a legal form, but nonetheless, I mean, we're talking about tens of millions of people whose daily reality is now a condition of slavery. in 2023.
Yeah, it's extraordinary.
Yeah. It's a terrible tragedy.
Yeah.
And it's not one that's easily resolved.
No.
But I suppose all we can do is all of us can just play our part. Exactly.
Yeah. So I actually see one last question coming in here. Well, there are a few more, but the last one we'll take has preempted a question I have for you, and it's a very important one before we wrap up, David. Where can people buy the book? Anybody who wants to pick it up, where can they pick it up?
Okay, well, you can buy it online from the likes of Amazon, for example. You can order from Amazon, and pretty much every website, on a online bookselling website, you can order it from that. There's also an ebook, which can be downloaded from Amazon, so that comes instantaneously through to your Kindle device. And if you're, say, for example, in the west of Ireland, my own home place of Galway, then I recommend Kenny's in Galway, the bookshop there. So they certainly have it. They have it in store as well.
Excellent.
Okay, and please do support the work too by giving it a review, because that's really important as well. It helps spread the message of the book. So that's always very much appreciated too.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much, David.
Thank you.
So I suppose that brings us to a close this evening. This video that you've just watched will remain on the OLA Facebook page. It's obviously, we're live streaming right now, but once we finish live streaming, the video will remain on as a recording on the Facebook page, which you can rewatch. You can share it to your own Facebook page, or you can share it with others, which we strongly encourage. As I explained at the beginning, today is the International Day of Prayer and Awareness against human trafficking, and the key word there being awareness. Human trafficking is a crime that is, for the most part, hidden in plain sight. So raising awareness is crucial, and that's what David is doing with this book. That's what we're doing with this conversation this evening. So, as David's pointed out, we can all do something, and the first step is by becoming conscious of human trafficking. We can begin to challenge it. So please do share this video far and wide. And I would encourage you to pick up David's book. It really is an excellent read, and it really does explain the issues in such a clear and simple manner that's really easily understood. So listen, thanks a million, David, for taking the time to speak to us this evening. And I'd like to all of our viewers and listeners tuning in on Facebook Live to thank you who tuned in to watch, to listen to our conversation this evening, or whatever time of the day it is, wherever you are. So listen, thanks a million, and good evening, and God bless.
Right, you're off.
Okay.